Thomas felt the familiar pang of regret when he thought of the choices he had made in his life. Really one. Jennifer. When they were both seniors, he had caught her kissing another boy at the prom, when she thought he had left to go to the bathroom. She claimed she was drunk and begged for his forgiveness. He'd broken up with her on the spot and thought he'd never look back, but he had looked back. Often. More than 20 years later, he's still... So if we find it, what's your bet? BerenstEin? BerenstEin? John said, breaking Thomas out of his bitter train of thought. Well, honestly, I think it's going to be BerenstEin like I remember, but I'm not sure. If it says BerenstEin, then we'll have a whole other question to answer, John said. What's that? Thomas asked, not sure if he wanted to know. Who has the power to erase all evidence from the internet of the name change? And if they could do that, why would they? Thomas had an answer for that. Well, the short answer would be just to see what they were capable of getting away with. So much of our collected and personal memories are stored online now. The ability to subtly or not so subtly change things is so much power, it actually would have me rooting for alternate timelines. Be careful what you wish for. Thomas followed John's eyes to the book and saw the old hardcover. His eyes immediately went to the familiar handwriting. The BerenstEin Bears. John was holding it out for inspection. Thomas noticed his own breathing increased as John seemed to go steadier. All right, no problem. The BerenstEin Bears. John was holding it out for inspection. Thomas noticed that his own breathing increased as John seemed to get steadier. Thomas held the book. It looked so familiar, and yet the name looked so foreign. I guess I was wrong, was all he could say. I don't think you were. I think you remembered it perfectly. Then John opened his briefcase and took out a gun and a grenade. What are you doing? It was almost a statement in a whisper. John's breathing was softer than ever. Thomas, think of a number between 10 and 20. Though the number 12 flashed into his mind, Thomas shook his head in refusal. Please put those things away. John pulled the pin of the grenade. No! Thomas shouted and started to turn away, and as quickly started to go after the grenade. When he turned, he was staring directly into the muzzle of the gun, and it stopped him cold. He backed up a few steps, afraid that if he turned and ran, he'd end up with a bullet in his back. He was in shock from the way things had turned out. Even as he ducked and covered his body with his arms, there was a part of his mind still calm enough to realize that the grenade should probably have gone off by now. He looked up. It's not a live grenade, is it? John held it out for him to see it. I assure you it is very live. I also assure you that we are very dead in whatever timeline the two of us just branched off of. You're insane. Thomas stood, wondering if the gun was as impotent as the grenade had been. John seemed to read his mind. He opened the cylinder, and Thomas could clearly see that bullets were loaded. They could be blanks, but he wasn't going to take the chance just yet. He looked at the book, which had fallen to the floor when he had started to run. Still BerenstEin's. John smiled ruefully. I wish it was as simple as that. The timelines are like branches. Once you branch off, you can't go back. Or, at least that's what I thought until tonight. What, you thought? You thought, and you're pulling the pin on what you say is a live grenade? What is the point of all this? Why did you come here tonight? Thomas's eyes demanded an answer. John put the gun under his own chin and pulled the trigger before Thomas could react. Thomas heard a click, but nothing else. John pointed the gun down. That may be the 2,000th time I've done that. Maybe the 10,000th. It's not like I keep a count. In the timeline I just branched off of, you were probably calling an ambulance. But it's too late, because the fact that the gun didn't go off in this timeline means that I'm already dead in that one. You need help, John. Serious help. Let me help you. Just give me the gun. Thomas held out his hand. Instead of turning the gun over, John turned it on Thomas and started pulling the trigger. Thomas screamed as he heard the click, click, click of the trigger being pressed. By the time he looked up, he had lost track of how many times the trigger had been pressed. That was 8. plus the one I shot at myself makes 9. John kept the gun pointed at Thomas and continued. Any more and it might be the number you picked, between 10 and 20. So now it's about time I answered your question. Why did I come here tonight? Why did you come here tonight? John looked around. I loved this place when I was a kid. Reading books here helped me escape from some bad stuff that was going on at home. His voice wavered. Some really bad stuff. Your dad was one of the nicest men I've ever met, and I was so jealous of you. Me? Thomas was horrified at the thought that he'd been tracked down by a lunatic from the past that he couldn't even remember. How could I not be? To me, you seemed to have the perfect family, a great business, and a perfect girlfriend. What was her name again? Jennifer. Right, Jennifer. I was just checking to see if you knew that. What is that supposed to mean? The old familiar pang of regret started to fester again, and this time it was starting to mix with the newer anger. Thomas, I love this place so much that when I decided to commit suicide when my wife and kids died last year, I wanted to visit it one last time. But when I came here, it was a pharmacy. What? It was a pharmacy. I asked around, and then I looked you up on Facebook, and it said you were living in a different state, with your wife, Jennifer, and your 3 kids. Now I know you're delusional. Please just give me the gun, and we'll talk about it. You don't have to hurt me or yourself. The thought of the life that John had described for him made the pain of regret threaten to overwhelm him. I'm not delusional. Like I said, I've put this gun under my chin thousands of times and pulled the trigger. Not long after I started, I noticed the BerenstEin bear name change and other things I couldn't be sure of. The fact that so many people remember the name as BerenstEin made me realize that at some point on this timeline, everyone must have died somehow. I wanted to find a reason why. If I can't end my life, at least I want some purpose to it. And when I pulled the trigger sitting inside my car tonight outside the pharmacy, when I opened my eyes, the pharmacy was no longer there. Your bookstore was. So maybe I found my purpose. You. Thomas allowed himself to think about the prom. What might have happened if he had forgiven Jennifer and worked things out? Marriage? 3 kids? No lonely rooms above a bookstore, which he appreciated but was never passionate about? He had been too guarded to even look her up through all these years, but he knew that she, like him, had never married. He shook himself from the reverie. I can't believe that, was all he said. Well, maybe you will if the number you chose was 10, John answered, as he put the gun under his chin and pulled the trigger. It wasn't 10, Thomas said. John laughed without humor. Tell that to the version of you in the timeline where I just fell dead on the floor. Whatever number you choose after I blow my brains out, I'm hoping you'll take the theory more seriously. Of course, I'll just jump into another timeline where there will be a you who doesn't believe. He pulled the trigger again. Click. It wasn't 11, Thomas said. Even if you believe that you will always jump into a new timeline every time you pull the trigger, what's your end game here? There was a strong part of him, one that he was trying to not acknowledge, that was trying to stall for time since the number 12 was up next. John put down the gun momentarily. I don't know if it's possible, but I'm going to keep pulling this trigger until I branch into a timeline where my wife doesn't get behind the wheel after 2 drinks. Thomas gave the statement the time and weight it deserved. Then, I'm sorry that happened, but didn't you say that things from the past can't be changed? That's what I thought. That's why I got so wrapped up in the BerenstEin name change. How could so many people have shifted from the same timeline? It took my focus off thinking I could never shift into a timeline where my wife and kids still exist. But then I saw this bookstore, and you, and your life here. Infinity. It's a pretty big number. And FYI, John said with a humorless smile, infinity is not actually a number. Thomas saw tears welling up in John's eyes. John picked up the BerenstEin Bear book from the floor. Thank you, Thomas. Thomas felt as if he was moving in slow motion, as the gun came up too fast under John's chin as he pulled the trigger for the 12th time. Later, much later that night, after first the ambulance and then the coroner had left, and the police had asked many questions, Thomas sat down at his computer and started to enter letters into the search bar. BEREN. He stared at the blinking cursor for a few moments and then erased what he had written and started typing again. Jennifer.